Hey everybody! I wasn't sure it was we got
Welcome,
maybe
welcome to Cognitive Theories of Bilingualism and the Curriculum.
I'm Dominic.
I'm Eric.
And I'm Mark. This is our overview here. We're going to talk about the previous theories that were presented in the Baker reading and the current theories, boundaries and limitations of those theories, and implications for the curriculum, and then criticisms. During the presentation, we will be presenting um, different questions, posing questions for you to respond, and giving you time to respond to them.
The reading, Baker introduces two proficiency models, one of which is the separate underlying proficiency model, where the languages are held separately in the mind, and whether you look at it as a balancing act or as the two language balloons, what happens is that when you are increasing competency in one language, whether that's language one or language two, the other language will diminish in size or diminish in competency. So they kind of work against each other in a way. And in the common underlying proficiency model, which kind of takes away from the other one, um, you have one central operating system for both languages. And though both languages are still somewhat separate, there is an underlying cognitive process that is producing the language. So our first question to consider then is, where do you see these models or these proficiency models in your school? And are there people in your school who you see thinking or using the separate underlying proficiency model? Or is this widespread in your school that the common underlying proficiency model is understood?
Okay, so in the Baker article, Cummins did some research that came up with two icebergs above the surface, one being the first language and the other being the second language. But below the surface, they're connected, they're fused together. So the two languages do not function separately, but they operate through the same central processing system. And in the Baker article, they summarized the common underlying proficiency model in 6 parts. Um, One of them was that it didn't matter which language the person is using, but that thoughts, talking, reading, writing, and listening, not walking, I almost said walking, come from the same central engine. And so when someone has 2 or more languages, that it's all integrated, the thoughts are. Number 2, that people have the capacity to store 2 or more languages, so people can function in 2 or more languages with ease. Number 3, information processing skills and educational attainment can be developed through 2 languages, and cognitive functioning and school achievement might happen through one channel, monolingual channel, or equally through 2 well-developed language channels, but they all go back to that same central operating system, the iceberg underneath the surface level. Number 4, the language that the student is using in the classroom needs to be well developed. So in the third part, it talked about it being through two well-developed channels, and part 4 really um, emphasizes that it needs to be sufficiently well developed to process through the cognitive challenges that the classroom demands. Number 5, if children are made to operate in an insufficiently developed second language, it's not going to function at its best. So the children are going to struggle, and the quality and quantity of what they learn from this cognitively demanding classroom is going to be weak. The product that they produce is going to be weak and impoverished. Part 6, that when one or both languages are not functioning fully, that cognitive functioning and academic performance may be negatively affected. And so that leads us into the next theory. And of course, before we move on from this slide, we would just want to ask, what evidence do you see in your practice that supports the common underlying proficiency model, if any?
The next theory that we are going to look at is the thresholds theory, which um, evolved from the common underlying proficiency model. And in the thresholds theory, you can visualize a 3-story building. And in those different levels, there are different thresholds. And according to this theory, at the first threshold, students need to attain this threshold in order to avoid negative consequences of bilingualism. And at the second threshold, students should gain this level to achieve experience or to gain experience for the possible positive benefits of bilingualism. So in this model, as you guys can see from the visual, the 3 different levels can be described by children, being at the lower level, having low levels of competence in both languages. They likely have cognitive disadvantages. And after the first threshold on the second level, children have age-appropriate competence in one but not both languages and are unlikely to have cognitive advantages or disadvantages. And then past the second threshold on the third level, children have age-appropriate competence in both languages and have cognitive advantages. So some examples from the Baker reading included as competency in 2 languages increased, so did deductive reasoning in math. But if there was limited competency, then this could result in negative cognitive outcomes. The Baker reading also stressed that these low levels in English will probably have a limiting consequence for students to cope with content and other curriculum. It also stresses that dual language programs that allow students to operate in more developed home languages can result in superior performance compared with submersion and transitional bilingual education. And one criticism though for this model at this point is that it's extremely hard to define what an appropriate level of language proficiency would be, and this could be based on a student to student basis or a classroom to classroom basis. So just a couple things to think about. As we move on, you can think about these two questions. What evidence do you see of students learning at different thresholds? What are their achievements like, and how would you support students in different thresholds?
Okay, so the thresholds theory evolved into the developmental interdependence hypothesis. And here, the main point being made is that your language 2 or second language competence is dependent on the level of competence already achieved in the first language. So it goes back to the central operating system in a way that however much you've developed your first language, it gives you an ability to, or a quicker ability to develop the second language. So if you're more developed in language 1, it will be easier to acquire language 2. And then it goes on to say that there are different facets of the language that are quicker or easier to learn than others. And conversational language, which we'll get into more on the next slide, is easier or quicker to develop. And I think in the article, Cummins has done some research that says it takes about 2 years to acquire conversational language, whereas it takes 5 to 7 years, or as we know, much more than that, potentially, to acquire academic language proficiency. And then the last piece in this, with the hypothesis, talks about how these different facets of language also carry different connotations depending on in what situation and context you use them. So if you're in a math class, for example, and you're using the word mean, in a social context or conversational language, mean has certain meanings or connotations, and in an academic mathematical setting, we're talking about average and how there can be a mistake or confusion surrounding words like that go across content areas or across the boundary between conversation and academic language. Thus, it's hard to draw a line between the two. So we have this image that kind of shows that and how it, in a way, it ties back to the iceberg model. So the question with the developmental interdependence hypothesis is, what connections can you make between this hypothesis and the common underlying proficiency model?
All right. So, as Dominic was saying, there's a difference between connotation. There can be differences in connotation that bring about confusion. So, Cummins created or expressed these differences in two different terms. We have a BICS versus CALP, which is basic interpersonal communicative skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. And so BICS is social language, everyday language used in conversations. It's very informal, face-to-face, and context is embedded in the situation. Um, so there's a lot of nonverbal support that helps secure understanding. With CALP, there's context-reduced academic situations so that that support, the nonverbal support, is not present, and it requires high order, the critical thinking, analysis, synthesis, evaluation, those higher order thinking skills to help understanding. So it's yeah, they're formal communication that conform to the societal standard. It's used in school, work, those formal settings. The situation is often referred to as context reduced. So the distinction between BICS and CALP is aided by another image of an iceberg. Here we have a more complex iceberg. Above the surface, you have the language processes and the cognitive domains. And then underneath the surface, the CALP skills, the higher order thinking, the analysis, and the synthesis, those are below. And then, so what happens above the surface? The basic language skills, you have pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar. Though Baker says that it was never intended as contextually universal. It's not a complete theory. Baker also says that this conceptual distinction has been unfairly criticized because it doesn't have components that it was never intended to contain. So our think time, get your pencils ready, folks. What types of language are assessed in formative and summative assessments at your school or your classroom? Enjoy.
So this BICS versus CALP um, has many boundaries and limitations. So for example, there are many dimensions of language competency in this, and there are many more than just two stages. There's some distinctions between BICS and CALP that it doesn't indicate how they can be defined or tested. Using these terms can oversimplify a student's situation and therefore can be misused. Language proficiency is relative to an individual's total environment, so there are many other factors that you have to take into account, such as culture, class, other socioeconomic issues. Typically, BICS is developed first, and then there's CALP. Usually, the CALP favors middle-class standards on academic English speakers, and so there's a bias against speakers of dialects, even within dialects of English. This theory has persuaded many educators not to prematurely mainstream English language learners because it requires emerging bilinguals to acquire the standard academic English that is being taught. There is some interpersonal communication that isn't necessarily less cognitively challenging as academic language. And lastly, there are different contexts that have different expectations and perceived patterns of appropriateness, and school is only one context for higher order language production.
So Cummins developed or considered some instructional implications for CALP in an educational or instructional setting, and he broke them into three components: cognitive, academic, and language. In the cognitive implications, it means, or Cummins suggests, that the instruction needs to be cognitively challenging and push the students into using higher order thinking skills, such as evaluating, inferring, generalizing, and classifying. And outside of cognitive implications, there are the academic implications for each curriculum and content that's being taught, and that the content area you're teaching, whether it's science and math or geography, needs to coincide with language instruction. And so you're actually specifically teaching the language of the academic area as well as the content of the area, or the area's content. And then the final implication, according to Cummins, has to do with language and language awareness in different situations. So there is the linguistic conventions of a language that needs to be addressed, but also the sociocultural and sociopolitical aspects of language, and when and where it should be used, and what language represents, and how you address people in different contexts. So the next thing we'll talk about are the two dimensions that coincide with these implications, and how you can plan to meet the needs of your students through finding a balance and a gradual release between context-embedded communication and cognitively demanding communication. Before we get there, there's a question for you to think. So here's our think time. Can you think of a student who has been exited from an ELD program who has struggled in a mainstream classroom, and if any of these implications could be seen as reason for the struggle?
So this is the Bix CALP quadrant that Dominic was referring to, and it shows the context embedded communication, and then versus the context reduced communication, and then the cognitively demanding or undemanding communication, and how language learners, emerging bilinguals, learn. They're going to need context-embedded communication, so these face-to-face gestures, facial expressions, concrete objects of reference, but then also cognitively demanding communication, where you have field-specific vocabulary, complex language structures, and abstract concepts and new ideas. And as they acquire the language, that it will move to context-reduced communication. So there's going to be a lack of nonverbal cues, abstract language, and that's where the higher order thinking skills, that analysis and synthesis of these ideas and concepts will come into play. So think time, folks. Think of a lesson you will teach this week. How can you use the quadrant to plan your instruction? And where would you plot your lesson in this quadrant? So thinking about the context-embedded communication, context-reduced communication, Baker came up, in the Baker article, there were a couple graphics, a couple graphs that showed the language proficiency and how long it took for emerging bilinguals to reach the level of language proficiency of a monolingual child. And as you see from the graphics, the graphs, that with context-embedded communication, the emerging bilingual catches up to the monolingual child in approximately 2 years, whereas in the context-reduced, it actually takes about 5 to 8 years for that to occur, for the language learner to reach the monolingual child.
All right, so there are some other criticisms of Cummings as it relates to language versus cognition. So first, socioeconomic statuses and sociocultural norms are not necessarily variables in theory when talking about the development of language and cognition together. And there are also some alternative outcomes at school, such as students' self-esteem, their social and emotional development, some other ways of thinking, such as creative and divergent thinking with long-term attitude to learning, unemployment, and moral development, which are oftentimes not considered. There are some criticisms also associated with how this is oftentimes defined through a middle class, probably a monolingual lens too. So that can be another criticism. Oftentimes, as we've discussed before, these labels oversimplify and create stereotypes of groups. Also, learning difficulties could result in intervention, but oftentimes intervention is taught in an environment without context, or oftentimes removed from the classroom altogether. So that might take away from some good social context with their peers. And lastly, empathizing with cultural background may lead to deficit thinking and or stereotyping, which can produce lower expectations and achievement. Sometimes this can create a situation where students might just achieve to a certain point that they are only expected to achieve instead of going past it.
Great. Hey, thanks everybody.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks for your ears.
Back now. But first, we have some questions for you. Get those pencils ready or your pens. Make sure they're sharpened or have ink.
Now that you have this knowledge, how will this impact your practice or your school?
And lastly, how could you educate other teachers at your school about these theories or the best practices based off of these theories?
Goodbye.